Africa feel that the first time they start menstruating, it is like they're going to die for the first time. And I felt the need to change that narrative. And I also felt the need to change the lives. So through my NGO called Curate, we go and we host menstrual education workshops in schools, corporates, youth organizations, where the intention is really to empower and uplift the young girl child in particular, but also the young boy child, about what really happens during the time of the month, and also to dismantle the period taboos and myths that they come across in their own ways. And you'll find that during this time, young girls in particular feel so afraid to talk openly about periods because society has told them to isolate themselves. Society has told them to keep themselves private. And it doesn't make sense to me that a natural and biological function should be seen private. It also doesn't make sense to me that young girls in particular don't feel confident enough to say the word vagina, which is a body part of them. It's theirs. So I think it's really important that, through the work that I do, that people really just see it as this minister of menstruation who goes out to different communities to really tackle the period taboo.
Wow. Uh, as you said, you have done the research on menstrual health hygiene. Would you explain the micro details about the daily lives of the girls and women who are menstruating for 5 days or 4 days? I mean, what did they do at the first day or right after the menstruation, during the first day, second day, third day, a kind of 24 hours activities or lives of menstruating girls and women?
Mm. So I think the reality of menstruators in South Africa is that period poverty is real. Um, a lot of young girls, women, and menstruators have to go and buy their sanitary product of choice. And poverty in South Africa is a huge social economic crisis that we're still tackling. There are a lot of households that live on grants, which are usually like 350 Rand, or sometimes it's less than 1,000 Rand, and sanitary pads cost more than 50 Rand. So sanitary pads in particular are therefore still seen as luxury items, especially for households where basic income is less than 2,000 Rand. And therefore that leads to a variety of obstacles that the young menstruator has to go through when trying to go to school, for instance. What happens is that young menstruators who have to go to school, the education is interrupted because now they don't have any sort of means to manage their period in a healthy way. So there'll either be choices where they'll choose to, use unhygienic materials such as leaves, cow dung, sand, newspaper. And the constant use of these materials can lead to potential infections, which will therefore be an extra burden and cost on these low to middle income menstruators. Or what ultimately happens is that these young menstruators decide not to go to school anymore. And the reality is that that has a huge impact on gender inequality, because now the male counterparts who can continue to go to school will still succeed, whereas young girls will have to stay at home. And staying at home can lead them to ultimate other risks, such as being involved in irregulated labor. Will be forced to be involved in child labor. They'll be maybe forced to be involved in child marriages. So ultimately, not having access to these sanitary products can potentially lead to more human rights violations on the young menstruator for schooling. Now, if we look at young menstruators in the workplace, unfortunately, South Africa does not have any specific period policy that caters for menstruators to take off leave when it comes to work. And in particular, this can be very hard for menstruators who experience very debilitating cramps or any form of hectic period symptoms. And what then that happens is that they're expected to go to work, or they're expected to take sick leave, and that will therefore affect their productivity. And in certain cases, certain companies therefore usually deduct your pay, and therefore that affects, the menstruator's ability to cater for themselves, and that is an issue. So I think when we look at period poverty and the reality of the lived experiences, it is something that has a huge effect not only on the young girl child but also young menstruators in the workplace. And it's all simply because we're not talking openly about it. It's all simply because we're not sharing our experiences and realities about what the impact periods have on us. So yeah, I think I always just refer to how if menstruation isn't properly managed, it can ultimately lead to further human rights violations. In particular, it affects the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 and Sustainable Development Goal number 5. Development goal is to ensure quality education for all, and then development 5 is to achieve gender equality. And Sustainable Development Goals, part and part, speak to human rights. So governments therefore have, or states rather, therefore have the obligation to achieve these things, in particular in dealing with menstrual health management.
Thank you very much. It is very interesting. As you said, because of the poverty, because of the poor socio-economic condition, the girls deprived from attending schools during the menstruations, and they might trap on the child marriage or early marriage. But I wanted to know more depth. What is the situation within their house, within their family? How what kind of conversation they have within the family members, or what kind of taboos, stigma, restriction they have to follow within the house or within the family members. Would you share a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I think one thing about period myths is that it is a reality for all menstruators over the world, and it varies in different practices. I know, for instance, in Nepal, there is the practice of the Shao Paudi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, where essentially young menstruators are expected to isolate themselves in menstrual huts. And I do know that the Supreme Court did outlaw it to say it needs to be banned. But the reality is that there's certain communities that still practice it as a way of isolating menstruators. But in South Africa in particular, what happens is that when a young girl who has maybe started menstruating at the ages of 8 um, declares that she's been bleeding, usually what happens is that she has a conversation that is met with fear and subjective cultural practices rather than a conversation with objectivity and celebration. Because the reality is that having your period should be seen as a transition from childhood into adulthood. And in South Africa in particular, being on your period at a young age is usually seen as a thing of you've been having sex with people, and therefore that is wrong. So what usually happens is that the young girl is sort of chastised, she's isolated, and therefore she's therefore told to not talk to anyone about it because being on your period is shameful. You also hear of really interesting practices where young girls in particular are told, you shouldn't touch a boy when you're menstruating, you shouldn't cook food, you shouldn't enter a place of worship or church. If you are married and you are from a religious background, you are expected to sleep on the bed or sleep in a separate bedroom from your husband because you don't want to have him dirty or impure. And all of these restrictions are really just to restrict the menstruator to keep to themselves, to not tell anyone they're menstruating. No one should know that you're bleeding. No one should see it, because if someone had to see it, then it's shameful. And I think that is a very anxious time. I mean, as menstruators ourselves, we are going through hormonal fluctuations during this time. So our anxiety is already up, and now we have to face dealing with these cultural and religious practices as a way of just removing ourselves from society. And I think that is just really unfortunate, because what it shows is that the period taboo in itself is not really being met and challenged with objective facts. Because if people really understood what the process of menstruation was, in which it is a very beautiful process, right? You have the opportunity of life that hasn't necessarily met fertilization, and so what's happening is that the egg is shedding. That is beautiful, and that means that we need to celebrate that in an instance and meet it with sensitivity, rather than just having menstruators feel ashamed for their bodies.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify about the chowpade. The chaupadi is a word given or using in a certain part of the West Nepal, but it has already outlawed by the Supreme Court. And we also have the law. If there is
Mm,
any abuses or discrimination or restriction associated with the menstruation, it is also punishable since 2018. And but regardless of the caste, class, religion, region, across the country there is some sort of restriction, as you explained earlier. That means not allowed to speak publicly, not allowed to touch with the men members, have to sleep in the separate bed. That kind of restriction practicing across the country. But in few parts of the country, in the western part of the country, they have a menstrual hut, but that also under the dismantle process according to the law. And officially it is already dismantled, but still in some places those people who still have a strong faith, deep faith towards the religion or towards the culture, they still practicing it. Thank you very
mm.
much. Very, we have a we are in a about how many hours? 4 hours apart, but
Yes,
we have many similarities while we talk about the menstrual dignity. No matter where we are, no matter what color we have, no matter whether we are educated or not, whether we fall under the global south or global north, we have the similarities, and together we can make difference. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I wanted to know more about your book.
mm,
Your book called Peril of the Patriarchy, something like that, right? Can
yes,
you
yes.
explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, so The Perils of Patriarchy is a collaborative essay book
Mhm.
written from 10 women's experiences of patriarchy in South Africa and outside of South Africa. What it seeks to do is it seeks to really understand how the patriarchy affects us as women in a day-to-day basis, because I think it usually with conversations about patriarchy with men or whoever, they tend to find it to be very ethereal. It tends to be seen as a thing that doesn't exist. But this book, what it seeks to do, it seeks to really understand how the patriarchy can affect me in the workplace, how the patriarchy can affect another lady in the beauty industry, how the patriarchy can affect one when it comes to relationships. Really just trying to get people to come to the table of understanding, so that you understand that the patriarchy not only just affects us as women, but it affects men too, and that we're being constricted by this social system that has lasted for longer than technology has, and we're not necessarily doing enough to challenge and change the ways we see how patriarchy can be dismantled. So the reason why I also wrote this book was that I also find that being a menstrual activist is also fighting patriarchy in itself, because the period taboos that have been, if you look back in history and see who actually was behind the creation of the period taboos, you find that it was men. It was men who genuinely didn't understand periods, and so they decided to send a wave of misinformation regarding our bodies, and it's just continued and continued and continued. And thus, menstrual activism is a part of third wave feminism in fighting and dismantling the patriarchy that tells us that we should be restrictive about our bodies. So yes, the book is available worldwide.
Wow.
People can get it anywhere in the world, no matter where you are. You can read it. You can also listen to our podcast. We have a podcast where we share our experiences on different social issues with different people, because we're just really trying to get more people on board and understanding how it is that patriarchy impacts them directly.
Wow, congratulations. Very
Thank
proud
you.
of you.
Thank you.
We also launched a book called Dignified Menstruation,
Mm.
Dignity of Menstruators Throughout the Life Cycle, a practical handbook, just last December 8. It is also available online, and it is the collective work of 45 contributors all around the globe. I mean, 20 the contributors representing from 22 countries across the globe. um, we all talk about the gender equality, we talk about the women empowerment, peace, menstrual hygiene, but we are not um, um, advocating, or we are not re-examining our past and reimagining our future from the perspective of the menstrual dignity. That is why we decided, or we inspired to write or publish that book. I think this book is the first book around menstrual dignity.
Mm.
Let's back to the menstrual dignity, or dignified menstruation. Dignified menstruation is just a state of free from any kind of stigma, taboos, restriction, abuses, violence associated with menstruation throughout the life cycle. That means it covers the young age, pre-puberty, puberty, even the menopause, till the death, in some culture even after the death, because
Mm.
the death ritual is vary between men and female, because in some cultures the because of the menstrual blood they consider as a dirty, and they have the different death ritual cultures. That is why we wanted to see the dignity, menstrual dignity throughout the life cycle, from
Mm.
home to tomb. So in that connection, how do you see your activism, um, whether, I mean, whether it more aligned with menstrual hygiene, or more aligned with the menstrual dignity, or it is overlapping? How do you see? I mean, menstrual dignity or dignified menstruation is an umbrella term. It
Yeah.
covers so many things. It talks
Mm.
about the health, hygiene, education, empowerment, peace, at the immediate level, at the long term level, at the childhood, at the menopause. So it's a very holistic approach. And
Mm.
in that situation, where do you put yourself, or your campaign, or your organization's campaign, within the frame of the dignified menstruation?
Mm. So I think, yeah, I think dignified menstruation, um, it being a holistic term, an umbrella, as you rightfully mentioned, really does tackle on a lot of categories in society. It doesn't just only focus on the access to sanitary products. It also needs to focus more on the access to infrastructure,
Yeah,
because a menstruator doesn't only just need pads, they also need
yeah.
the water to wash their hands after
Mm,
disposing the pads. They also need a dustbin to throw the pads away.
mm,
On top of that, it also, a menstruator needs the education about what is exactly going on with their body, so that they can make the right decisions going forward about, do I need to see a doctor if I'm experiencing pain? Or, this month I didn't have a period, what must I do? They're making informed decisions on that, because menstrual health management, or dignified menstruation, covers each and every sector, not only just access to products. So in terms of my menstrual activism, what I really do focus on primarily is the menstrual activism, because there's a lack of it in South Africa. You'll find that a lot of the times when I talk about periods, either be it on Twitter, or if I'm doing a live video, what happens is that there are a lot of messages that I get regarding, simple, basic period questions. I've been bleeding for 8 days. Is that normal? Experiencing blood clots. Is that normal? And what that shows to me is that young adults who are even 25 years old are still not certain about a biological process that is a part of them. So what that means to me is that there needs to be more educational content out there that is easily disseminated for people to just understand. But also my educational content falls more into understanding how young people, like young children in particular, are learning about their bodies and also learning about puberty, because puberty is such a critical transition in one's life. Puberty is the one aspect where, you know, it affects human rights in particular. And if it's not done properly, if it's not met correctly, it can have a huge devastating consequences for an individual. So for me, it's really important in that, you know, in as much as young adults are probably equipped with having the data in watching YouTube videos or Googling these things, young children are still being faced with the reality that their parents or their guardians or teachers are not feeling confident enough to have the conversations with young children. So my call and my passion and my purpose is to make sure that there's content that seeks to equip the young children with critical thinking, so that they never just accept it as, oh, my mom told me to not cook when I'm on my period. I think that's really important in education, or in particular menstrual education, giving the individuals the agency to choose, you know, the right form of content they want to learn, and also to choose the right product they want to use. I think that's really also another important part of dignified
Yeah,
menstruation. We need to
yeah,
give menstruators the agency to choose.
yeah,
Mm,
absolutely agree. Menstrual dignity is all about the mm, guaranteeing the dignity during
mm,
a menstruation is, we believe, on human right.
mm,
Since 1948, globally we keep talking about the human right, that means
mm,
dignity, and the menstruation is just uh, mm, mm, uh, ignored. I mean,
mm,
there is no discussion about the menstruation. Menstruation is really not in the mainstream. We always talk about the gender policy, gender lanes, but
mm,
gender policies, gender lanes fails to acknowledge the needs and the urgencies or priorities of the menstruators. The menstruators could be the disabled, could be the transgender, could be from anywhere, in school, in workplace, in at home, in informal sectors, in public transport, in public other places like cinema. So it's a dignified menstruation is like a throughout the life cycle approach. It's not a project.
mm,
It's not a it is not fall under time one single time frame.
mm,
It's a very ongoing process, and we often discuss in our network that the gender policy is not enough to address the dignified menstruation. We need to um, go beyond the gender policy. As we always said, while we talk the dignified menstruation is beyond the product, beyond the infrastructure, beyond the hygiene. The hygiene product are very important element of the dignified menstruation, but it is not enough. We have to dismantle the taboos, the stigma, the restrictions, and we need to build the agency since childhood. If they have the capacity to bargain with their parents, if they have the capacity to say no with their brothers, they can say no to their partners or husbands or co-workers. This is how we saw the dignified menstruation at large, and menstrual dialogue or dialogue on menstrural dignity. It creates the power and also saves the power for gender equality. So menstrual discrimination we considered as a form of gender-based violence and violation of the human right, and we are in the same board. We, I feel so proud and happy.
mm,
Minister of Menstruation, I wanted to know about your organization. What is it? How do you engage the youth, and what are the challenges? And what are the best practices so we can replicate? The friends who are listening right now, they can replicate. I need a very practical knowledge and skills so everyone can get benefit.
mm. So yeah, Curate is a non-profit company, and we focus on enhancing critical thinking skills in young people on social issues. So one of the issues that we focus on are menstrual health. And I felt that, I look back in my personal life, and I was trying to remember when I had the first conversation about menstrual health in school, and all I can remember is just, having one person coming in to speak to us, have a boring slideshow and not interacting and engaging, and not really understanding that menstruation is an issue that affects us. So we therefore need to be involved in this issue, or be involved in speaking about these things. So what then that made me, how that inspired me rather, is that it really made me feel that I should create these fun workshops where the young person equips himself with the right knowledge, and confidence to navigate this workshop for an hour, and unpacking the period taboos, but also learning about what periods are and how they can properly take care of themselves during this time of the month. And the nice thing about our workshops is that they are friendly and open to all. So it's not just only for the girl child, but we've hosted workshops for boys as well. And the boys react positively as much as the girls do. So what that tells me is that there's a hunger to learn, and there's a willingness and positivityness of or positivity towards the content. Because I think, when you talk about periods, often people just don't know how to respond, because they were never taught about how is it that I respond to talking about periods. And so having these workshops where we have these fun different activities, that are just as simple as saying, if it's true, jump once, if it's false, clap once, having that combination of simple activities, but integrating the period content in them allows the participants to have fun, but also to learn. So we have a tagline at Curate, which is called Eduliftment for Kids. And our tagline is really a cohesion of education and upliftment. And that is very important for us, because we always want the participants to leave as if they've learned something, but they feel uplifted about a social issue that affects them personally. So yeah, I think what's great about Curate is that we also have a great team of facilitators. I don't do this by myself. I have a great team of other facilitators that host the workshops. If we have a large group of people, we can split them into smaller groups to make it as intimate and fun as possible. But it's also really nice to see that these facilitators are taking on the call to changing period poverty into period positivity, so that it allows for more people to just change the world. Because if I had to do it by myself, I think I'd be very tired. But it's good to know that there's a movement behind ending period poverty, and it's not just me leading it by myself. I have other people that can do it too. So yeah, that's what Curate does. We also have a blog where, if educators, teachers, facilitators, parents want to read up on any specific social issue, not only just menstruation, if you want to learn about climate change and how that affects your children, if you want to learn about mental health and how to deal with, mental health with your children, there are these topics that have been written by experts in the field, young experts in the field, that that want to share their resources amongst the community. That's what we have as well. So we really are about just enhancing critical thinking with social issues for young people in South Africa.
Mhm. Thank you so much. How much mm, receptive from the boys or men or religious people? Usually, in my context, there is some sort of resistance from the boys
Mm.
in the beginning, from the men, and from the faith healers in the beginning. But when we keep continue the dialogue, and they agreed, and they become the champion, and they start to lead the campaigns independently. But in the beginning, it is some sort of resistance. So is the same way in South Africa, or it is more easier to engage the boys and men and religious
Um,
leaders?
it is a little bit easier to engage the boys and men, because there are foundations that really do focus on educating the boy child. We
Mm-hmm.
do have high levels of gender-based violence in this country, and I think there has been a lot of focus on the girl child and what the
Mm-hmm.
girl child needs, but then you're leaving the boy child behind, and the boy child doesn't know how to navigate these spaces of learning
Mm-hmm.
about manhood, learning about what it means to be a real man, learning about just, the general practice of respecting women. And so I think it's very easy to engage with the community stakeholders that deal within that space of trying to educate the boy child, and then hosting those workshops for them, because then the boy child is willing to learn outside of gender-based violence. He needs to learn that, okay, women do menstruate, and then what is expected of me as a man is that I need to be sensitive, or I need to respect women when they're menstruating, and I shouldn't ever disrespect them or be violent towards them. So it is a little bit easier in South Africa, but it depends on the provinces that you go to. So, for instance, our province, Gauteng, that I'm in, Gauteng is a bit of a very is a very progressive province. I haven't had a workshop where a man has come into the workshop and told us to stop what we're doing because it's blasphemy, or it's not, it's impure. We've never had that instance. In fact, what we've had is we've had male teachers, especially at schools, sit in the workshops, or even better yet, participate with the young girls, so that there's a creation of a safe space and trust, so that when we leave as facilitators, we can go leaving confident, knowing that the teacher that was in the presence of these young girls feels confident enough to talk about periods with them because he's also learned. When it comes to religious leaders, unfortunately, that's one space that I haven't really dealt with yet. I do remember having very brief conversations with an Orthodox a rabbi, where we did have a discussion about, what is expected of a woman when she is menstruating, in an Orthodox Jewish household. And I don't think there was really any room for conversation, because really it was more of a lecture than anything else. So I haven't really navigated that space of dealing with traditional religious leaders, because again, it is under researched, it's under-reported, because we're not having these conversations in these spaces to say, are church leaders and religious leaders talking openly and positively about periods, or are they choosing to turn the cheek and just continue the practice of perpetuating the period taboo? And that is something that I haven't navigated yet, because I'm not in that space. I only frequent within the menstrual education space. But if we ever had to host a menstrual workshop for a church, then I would believe that that church is open and progressive to learning about periods, versus churches that would, or religious institutions rather, that would choose to remain silent. So yeah, I think the period taboo still exists in these spaces, and they just choose to be silent rather than speaking openly. Mm.
Yeah, yeah. In many cultures, the menstrual practice link with the religion.
Mm.
Menstrual practice link with the culture, and many people do not like to cross the religious or cultural practices. They do not like to make disappointed or unhappy to the religious people or parents or elders, family members. So this is how I wanted to know, and what we believe that without redefining the menstruation in walks of life, I mean in the religion, in the culture, in the school, in the health, in the hygiene, in the environment, in the business, uh, it is very difficult to address, because menstruation is a very complex and multifaceted phenomena. As you said, system thinking, critical thinking, and usually the earlier people just see the menstruation from the perspective, the medical point, from the perspective of the business point, and they do not see, or they overlook the impact, immediate and long term impact in society, in politics, in economics. That is why we struggle so much. And globally, globally, the house is not safe at all, and they, especially the girls and women, subject to violence from the non main members. That means could be father, brother, uncle, something like that. So, in that situation, do you see the any connection between menstrual discrimination and rape or gender based violence?
Mm, definitely. I think when I was researching for the United Nations in 2017, linking all of the Sustainable Development Goals, linking all of the human rights violations, and how menstruation is interwoven with the two, really opened up another door to violence. I think when we look at it from a religious and cultural perspective, even how certain texts see menstrual blood in itself, dirty and impure, sort of implies that you shouldn't ever interact with a menstruator. And I think, menstrual blood is the one form of blood that isn't met with violence. You don't have to fall and scrape your knee. There isn't a form of like you getting shot or stabbed. It's just you bleeding naturally. And yet we are met with violence either through trying to collect water. If, for instance, we have communities in South Africa where menstruators have to collect water, they have to walk more than 10 kilometers to collect water. Now, if a young girl is trying to collect water so that you can just wash your hands or perhaps wash your menstrual cup, and the path is not well lit, it isn't safe, she most likely will encounter perpetrators that will attack her. And also in terms of gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, there've also been instances where young women report, or women or menstruators report, actually being physically abused because their partner saw them stained the bed, or they stained their clothes. And so seeing that type of blood that is associated with being shameful and impure, therefore means that you need to be controlled, you need to be regulated. How dare you stain and make everyone know that you're menstruating? Let me, abuse you so that you never do it again. Those are the also unspoken conversations we're not having about the realities of menstruation being associated with violence in communities where, menstruators are expected to isolate themselves far away from their homes. And so if it's assumed that a young girl is in this hut, in this menstrual hut, someone is going to take advantage or opportunity to sexually violate her. And so imagine now having to report to the community that on top of you menstruating, you're also sexually violated. It's a double burden, because usually when you are sexually violated and you try to report, they don't believe you. They'll say, what were you doing? What clothes were you wearing? And on top of that, you have to say, I was sexually violated whilst I was menstruating. You're just going to be met with even more fear and shame. So the reality is that we're not having enough conversations, open conversations about how menstruation and violence link. And I also say that violence doesn't always have to be the actual physical slap, or violence doesn't actually have to be, the emotional degradation of someone's mental self-worth. I feel that, in itself, young girls not having access to sanitary products is violent. I feel that young menstruators that have to use unhygienic materials like cow dung is violent. I feel that young girls who lose out on school because of their periods is violent. I feel that menstruators who don't have the access to proper sanitation infrastructure at work is violent, because our dignity is not being met. Our dignity is not being upheld. Our dignity is not being respected. And therefore, what we're always met with is violence. We're being met with the undignified manner of a health risk, or a societal risk. And that is an issue. That is violence in itself. So I think we need to really also just see it that menstrual health needs to be seen as a human rights issue, because if it's not properly managed, if it's not properly spoken about, it can lead to greater forms of violence outside of just physical abuse. It can lead to societal and economic obstacles that can have huge ramifications for one's life.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you so much for sharing. It's really enlightened. I'm thinking about your research.
Mm-hmm.
Why doing your research, did you find any kind of menstrual discrimination in the global north? I mean, the in developed countries, usually the Asia and Africa consider the poor countries uneducated, underdeveloped, and oh, these people are following the menstrual practices or menstrual discrimination. So, did you find any things in the developed among the developed countries while doing your research?
I mean, the reality is that our developed countries such as America, Canada, the UK, France, still have greater forms of period poverty. The reality is that, looking at my research, I did have to make a note to say that the lived experiences and realities of menstruators from the global north are very different to the global south. Their experience is that, yes, there is period poverty that exists, but not at the expense of their human rights. So unfortunately, when we look at global south menstruators, we see that there are a huge lot of social obstacles they have to go through. Whereas with the global north, it's mostly policy to ensure that, our young girls have access to pads, and also companies are ensuring period paid leave. So they're a little bit more advanced in that, but period poverty is still a reality. I mean, for instance, Scotland became the first country in the world last year to declare that they're going to issue free pads because they have girls from poor backgrounds that can't afford it, and that can affect their schooling. And you're probably thinking to yourself, how is it that Scotland, this global north or developed country, is experiencing period poverty? And it's because the period taboo exists universally. And it's because we're not having open conversations about it. And it shows it's not just affecting us more globally south, it's affecting globally north as well. So with my research, I think what was very interesting was when I was looking at the policies that countries were implementing in trying to tackle period poverty within Eastern and Southern Africa. The most, how can I say, the most looked down upon countries, Zimbabwe and Kenya, were the two most progressive countries when it came to um, addressing period poverty. They were the two countries that actually had policies addressing young girls having access and also education and removing of taxes. So that was a very interesting research thing that I came across where I was like, oh, okay, these two countries that globally are looked upon from a human rights perspective to say, Zimbabwe doesn't respect human rights. Oh, Kenya, in as much as it is a democratic country, it has its faults. They have policies advancing period poverty. When we look at South Africa, which will always be sort of applauded for having the best constitution in the world on paper. Implementation wise, we haven't even gotten to our government acknowledging the need to have period policies within government structures. We have had our government have a first period symposium, which was in 2018, but there was nothing in terms of government making the actual policy within paper to say that we are acknowledging that menstrual health must be seen as a human right. So it's very interesting that how a progressive country like South Africa is actually quite a little bit slow to advancing period positivity versus two countries like Zimbabwe and Kenya. I think in terms of the developed country narrative when it comes to period poverty, what I've learned from other menstrual activists around the world is that there is a greater need to having open conversations. So, people will have YouTube videos, people will do Zoom conferences, people will create artistic content. And the merrier is what I say. We have so much more to gain by just having people talk openly about their periods, because what it does then is that it creates a greater call for policy. It creates a greater way for traditional leaders, religious leaders to say, you know what, I think we need to openly talk about this and address it in society. So I think that's just the one thing I've noticed, is that in as much as we are progressive, developed countries might have the financial resources to tackle period poverty, they're still not openly talking about it. And that
Yeah,
needs to be addressed. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely agree. Just last January 21st, there was one news from United Kingdom. It
mm,
says out of 10, 9 menstruating women experience anxiety during the menstruation.
mm,
So that
mm,
means they are struggling. They are living in a sense of dehumanization. They do not, the agency which we discussed earlier, that is compromised heavily, and they are losing their confidence, their self-esteem, and the bargaining capacity for not only the menstrual product or menstrual discussion across the all aspect of their life.
mm,
So this is really high time to discuss about the menstrual dignity, no matter where we are. And we are opening the avenues to discuss about the menstrual dignity. But long way to go, but we
mm,
hope we can make it one day. We have limited time, only the about 11 minutes. I wanted to know about the challenges in your life while working as an activist, as an outspoken, young, dynamic activist. What kind of challenges you are facing? What kind of support you are getting from your family, from your friends, from your government? I wanted to know a little bit about it.
mm. I think, yeah, surprisingly enough, I've only gotten involved in menstrual activism since 2017.
Mhm.
I've always been an outspoken gender activist since I would say 2014. But my expertise into menstrual health really grew into the education space because of the research that I did for the United Nations. And then that research, therefore, sort of inspired me to do my master's in it. And then my master's, therefore, inspired me to do the menstrual workshops. So I think throughout my it would be what now 4 years of being a menstrual activist, I've learned along the way that you can't go far by yourself. You need the support of many other people who believe in the movement to go further. And I think having a group of friends and family that always root for me and support me has been the greatest blessing, because I could have easily just said, I'm going to be a menstrual activist. And then my family would say, no, you're never going to do that. What are you doing? That's shameful. But I think because of my love for feminism and human rights, my family saw that this is something I'm very passionate about. And they ultimately saw it being a career that could ultimately open up so many doors for me, not only just in South Africa, but internationally. I think what has been interesting so far is that I haven't as yet received, or I haven't as yet had the necessary conversations with government policy wise about what it is that they need to do in just really eradicating period poverty. I think a lot of South Africans would probably agree with me in saying that when it comes to policy, when it comes to any issue in South Africa, um, our government is very reactive. So they only react when things are trending, and they're not proactive. And so a proactive government would have realized that, period poverty is real. We need to ensure that young girls in South Africa have access to products by a certain date. They would also, if we had a proactive government would realize that we have a high number of pit latrines in our country, and that isn't sufficient enough for young girls who are menstruating to manage their periods. We need to improve our infrastructure. A proactive government would create a better educational curriculum regarding puberty and sexual health. Because the reality is that when it comes to our education, this one subject called life orientation, it's mostly seen as a subject where students tend to relax or tend to do homework for other subjects. And life orientation can be a really, really critical lesson or critical subject where people can learn about life changing issues in an engaging way. So I think I'm hopeful for the future and that there will be a day where, menstrual activists in South Africa can actually sit down and meet the key critical role players in government and in policy making, to be able to just try and eradicate period poverty from a policy perspective. But I also just hope that, from an educational content perspective, we are finding more creative ways in creating content that is easily digestible for young people. So yeah, I've had a very blessed journey in that people have supported me. I in fact even have a partner there. He takes pictures and videos for every workshop I go to, and he doesn't feel afraid to be there to support. And I think that for me speaks greatly, because some men would never even think about talking about periods, yet alone support their girlfriends' ventures in certain things. So I've been very blessed in my 4 years of menstrual activism. And yeah, I just hope that, the next 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, however long, will just lead me to a better path of learning, and most importantly, just eradicating period poverty in our realities.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I strongly believe that menstrual dignity is very important to eliminate the sexual and gender-based violence, improve
Mm.
sexual and reproductive health, and promote the human right. Because if we do not talk about the dignified menstruation, we cannot reach the target or accomplish the target of SDGs for HIV, or for family planning contraceptives, or safe abortion, or child marriage, or employment for all. So it's a very interconnecting each other. Unfortunately, in the SDG, across the 17 goals and 169 target, there is no explicit target or explicit goal for the menstruation. It's a very sad fact, but I strongly believe that without having dialogue on menstrual dignity, the achieving of SDGs target is not possible at all. Um, Many people more focus on the goal number 5, gender and women empowerment. But what about the goal number 8? How could we get the, how could we guarantee the decent work in the workplace or in a garment factory if the garment factory is not friendly for the menstruators?
Mm.
In many
Mm.
countries, let me give a one example. Our colleague from Sri Lanka was sharing that the owner of the factory did not allow to come for work during the menstruation, or she has to take the medicine to stop the menstruation. See, so it's not only the reproductive health. It's about the economic. It's about the politics. It's about the culture. It's about the um, mm, I mean the education, health. So there are so many factors going each other. It's a really interesting talk. We don't have much time, but I wanted to ask one question before we leave. What
Mm.
would be your last message to the young um, activists or young people who are following us, who are listening us right now?
I think my message would be that you are valued and you have a purpose. And I think that we should never ever undermine our role in society. There could be many organizations doing the work that you do, but maybe they're not focusing on the communities that you live in, the communities that you work with. And so there's always a need. There's always a value. There's always a goal and objective that needs more activists on specific issues, because the more activists we have, the more people will hear our voices, the greater will be taken, the more seriously will be taken in society. So for me, as a young person, I always tell young people to never ever doubt themselves, to always stay true to their vision, their mission, and their goal, and to never ever get down because people probably don't believe in it. Eventually, someone will see their mission, and it's just a matter of them believing in their own work and just doing it without any negativity towards it. Just get started is what I believe. If you have a simple idea, just get started. There'll be someone who will always want to support you. There'll be someone who perhaps wants to collaborate with you. Just get started is what I have to say.
Thank you so much, and congratulations for your hard work, for your writing. Keep it up, and no matter where we are, we are together, and we can contribute to each other. Global South Coalition has a membership. Anyone can get the membership freely, and we are also expanding our national networks. I mean the national chapters like Australia chapter, Philippines chapter. We are looking for the friends organization who wanted to work as a country coordinator, and also we are inviting the organization or the activist who wanted to share the ideas. Next talk, we will be talking about the menstrual leave all the way from UK. We try to create the space for the menstrual dignity. So everyone, not only the women, not only the girls, everyone, the men, the politician, the journalist, the religious leaders, the UN workers, everyone can hold the accountability to build the environment for menstrual dignity, cultivate the peace, justice, and empowerment where we all can live with the dignity as a human being. This is how we are looking, and it's really great honor. And we're really very proud of you, our dear Minister of Menstruation. Um, uh, we really um, uh, we don't have a word. Such a young age, you have done everything. As an author, as an activist, as an entrepreneur, even we don't have a time to talk about your entrepreneurship. And I was thinking to talk, but the time has already over. So thank you so much, Candice.